All right, so the next part of this is going to be adding some CSS to this kind of ugly looking site that we've got so far. If you haven't seen it, the first video details how to kind of set up your folder structure, duplicate out all of your HTML files, and set up all the linking and kind of the structure. This is going to be focused on just creating a style and actually making this look like a site that you might want to go to. In order to do this, now we could do our CSS in Atom, which is what we use for the HTML. You could go and just start typing our CSS here in Styles CSS. But we would have to keep saving it and then coming over here and then refreshing the page and then come back to Atom and then do something and then save it and come over here and refresh the page. And that gets a little bit tedious. We like to be able to see our changes as they happen. And to do that, we can use the Firefox Inspector. Lots of browsers have inspectors, pretty much all of them do. Chrome has an inspector. Safari has an inspector, although you have to enable it, I think, from preferences. To get to an inspector, you just right-click and open the Inspect Element option, or Q in Firefox, and that brings up this little window that we've got over here. So I'll close it and then go to Inspect Element, Q, and then we get this inspector. And what this does is let us see kind of how much space things are taking up on the page. If I mouse over the body, we can see how big that element is. We can see how big the navigation is, the header, etc. It also shows us different colors for different properties. So in this case, we see a little bit of yellow above and below, and what that corresponds to is the margin here. So we've got blue as our content, padding is the purple, which we don't have any padding on this one, and then yellow is a margin. We can actually use this little box model to look at and kind of see how big each one of these are. In this case, each of these elements, this is an H1 element that we created in HTML, this is an H3, I believe. They all have some default style that's already applied to them. So in this case, I've got this paragraph tag selected, and you can see it's got a default of 16 pixels worth of margin above and below. And if I selected this, the header, this H1 element, we can see that it's got actually 21.4333 pixels of margin above and below. So some of these we may have to turn off or kind of work with. Sometimes you need to turn them off. And actually, the first thing we're going to be doing is turning off the margin on the body so that we can actually get this thing to fill the entire screen. Because right now, the body is already set to have a little bit of margin all the way around. So to start styling this thing, we're going to go, instead of Inspector, we're going to click on Style Editor. And if you linked your CSS file properly in the first video, you should see this style.css, or whatever the name of your CSS file happens to be, should be available here. So you can click on that. You don't want to add it to the basic CSS. You want to make sure you're on style.css. And then we're going to go in here and we're going to start just adding some organization. So with comments, in CSS you do / asterisk, type in the comments. I use these, and actually a lot of people use these just to kind of provide a note and tell people what the code is supposed to be doing. In this case, this is going to be our top level stuff. It's going to control kind of stuff throughout the entire site. The next one we're going to do is going to control the Navbar. Styles. With comments, you start one with / asterisk, and then you end it with asterisk /. This one's going to be for the header. And then finally, the last one here, or not last one, content, and then footer. I'm getting a little bit lazy with these for the sake of time. There are lots of best practices and things that different people will use to keep their code organized, and you do want to make sure that it is readable and organized and easy to navigate. For me personally, I like to divide these things up into sections. Some people like to just make sure everything is in alphabetical order. And that really is going to be defined by who you're working with. Since I'm just making this for me, I'm going to be the only one working on it. I'm going to keep it organized by section like this. And section and flow, so it starts at the top and goes down through the page. So top level, first thing we want to do is we want to get rid of that margin on the body tag. And the way CSS works, its syntax is that you have a selector. In this case, body, and that's going to correspond to our HTML body tag. And then in curly brackets, you tell it what properties you want to apply or change for that. In this case, I want to change the margin, so I'm going to set margin to 0. So you type in the property that you want to change, and then a colon, and then the value that you want to apply to it. And always add your semicolon to end that declaration. So we've set or selected the body, and then we can add a whole bunch of properties to this so we can change things. Another thing that I want to change is the font. So we had set up our fonts, or Google fonts. I'm going to go back to Google Fonts, get my font family CSS. We're going to put that onto the body tag. If that's linked properly, you should see all of your fonts change. And we're also going to add the fonts for the headers. So H1. And you can actually, in CSS, if you use a comma, so H1 and H2, you can select multiple elements at once. So H1 and H2 are both going to get the same font, which is this Arvo. And that just lets you avoid having to apply this in multiple different places. This is actually going to be H1, H2, and the Navbar is actually going to get the same font. So everything on navigation is going to get that same font. Alright, so H1, H2, Nav, they all get the Arvo font. Let's go down into navigation. This is actually going to be the longest string of commands. Navigation is always the most complex. So with navigation, what we essentially have in our HTML structure is a navigation tag, a nav tag, with a span and an unordered list in it. Unordered lists aren't really necessary. They're kind of an old way of doing this, I guess, but it is good to kind of see this, and I want to look at unordered lists because they specifically have some default styles that we need to factor in. So let's start with nav, and then in curly brackets we go ahead and start changing some properties. I'm going to first start with a background color, so background-color, and we can set this to just with a name, like that. Or if we want, we can also specify a color. So by just typing in a name, we don't get a whole lot of control. But if you have this add-on called Colorzilla, they make it for Firefox, and I think also Chrome. You can click on that, and you can either pick a color from a web page, or you can also get this color picker right here, and you can adjust the color that you want. I'm going to go ahead and do this warm orange, actually, that it was already set on. It's going to work, so we can go ahead and do that. I'm going to make it a little bit less intense, too. And then copy the hex code from this. So Control-C, click OK, let's turn that off. And instead of orange, I'm going to paste in the hex code, but you need to remember, whenever you're using a hex code, make sure to put a £sign before it, and that will make your hex code active. Alright, so let's go ahead and add some more to this. So in order to get these kind of placed correctly, we also need to set the display to flex. Flexbox has made positioning things and making responsive design so much easier, so we're going to set display flex, and we're going to do some spacing for this. So we're going to do justify content and set it to space between. So there's different options. There's like space around, and this will space things out with just kind of keeping the space around elements even. We can do space evenly, and it just kind of divides up the space amongst elements just in different ways. I want to do this as space between. What that's going to let me do is set specific margins for left and right, and then let the space in between it kind of shrink and expand based on the width of the site. So this way things are kind of positioned on the left and right, and then we'll change based on the size of the window or size of the browser. Right, so justify content space between. We are also going to, let's go ahead and start adding some of the controls for our span and our UL tag. So let's go ahead and add a Nav Span. Now in this case, I'm not putting a comma between them, and what that lets me do is specify just the span tag on this navbar. So I want to look at the navbar, and I want to look for the span, and apply this only to this one, not to this span down here. So I'm only getting the one span. So in this span, we're going to go ahead and set it to have a margin on the right. So we're going to set margin. With margin, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. You can do margin left, so margin dash left, margin dash right, margin dash top. Or you can use this shorthand where you just type in margin, and then you can either put one number, which is going to give us the same value all the way around. So I'm going to write 2em. That'll give us the same value all the way around. If we go over to my inspector and expand this out and look at the span, here we can see that it's got margins, this yellow margin all the way around. That's not exactly what I want, because that's really making our border kind of huge. So instead, what I'm going to do is go back over to our style editor. I'm going to control this so it's not, we're not going to put any margin on the top or the bottom. So we're going to set 0 for our margin top. And actually, if you do this in order, it's going to start at top, right, bottom, and left, and go in that order specifically. So for the top, we'll have 0. For the right, we'll have 0. For the bottom, we'll have 0. And for the left, we'll have 2em. That way we only get margin on the left and nowhere else. Now we're also going to add some margin for our, we're going to change our unordered list elements. So we're going to do nav ul. Since ul is a direct child of nav, we'll go ahead and set margin. And it's already got some margin on it, so when we change this, we'll see that it changes kind of considerably. So we'll do margin and set it to 0 top, and we want 2em on the right, and then 0 on the bottom, and 0 on the left. So it's just kind of positioned it over to the left there. Now we also want these to display in line, so I'm going to set this actually to display in flex. And you can see the code hinting saves us a lot of time, because we can just type in a little bit and then press enter. So display flex, and we'll go ahead and get rid of the dots there a little bit later, but we'll for now set our size for this. So we want this to be basically half of the width of the page, while our word over here gets a little bit more space. Or actually set it to flex 1. And we'll go back up to our span over here. We'll set that to flex 1. And that'll basically divide this up so that we have these, each one of these elements gets half that space. We can kind of play around with this later. Like if we wanted to make the UL a little bit bigger, we can set it to flex 2. And so now it gets a little bit more space. We also want to set the elements inside of it to use up that space. So we're going to do justify content. I'm going to set this to space between also. So that way we kind of push those all the way out to the far right side. We're using up all of that space. And let's go ahead and go into our list items. So I'm going to do nav ul li. So I'm setting, going down through the list here, through the child elements, and we're going to get rid of this little dot next to them. So let's go ahead and do list style type. So list dash style dash type is none. And I think for that, that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and add our spacing for this. I'm going to go all the way back up to the nav. We'll add some padding. And for this, we're going to set padding to 2em on the top and 0 left and right. Actually, let's go ahead and make that 1em on the top. There we go. So now it's just expanding that. Okay, next we want to get rid of these little dots here. They're kind of bugging me, and start to focus on getting the fonts here tidied up. So to do that, I'm going to do nav ul li. And specify for these, we want list style type, and we're just going to set that to none. And we'll get rid of the dots there. We're also going to start to change the color. Now, unfortunately, if I change the color from here of these, which that purple and blue is not really showing up very well on the orange background, color won't do anything here. because the anchor tag has its own default style, and we need to be able to change that specifically on the anchor tag. So I'm going to cut that, Control X to cut a little bit of code. Then I go into another line here. So nav ul li a, and I'm just being very specific. You could just do like nav a and get all of the anchor tags, but I'm being kind of specific here, so it doesn't affect anything else. Oh, I forgot that right there. Nav ul, just had the u. So color, white, and we're going to get rid of that underline. So text decoration, none. And they're still active, but when we hover over them, they don't kind of jump out as being like active things that we can click on. So we want to change that too. So in order to give them some interactivity in CSS, we can basically just take this same selector, but add a pseudo selector to it. So we're going to add that, and then the colon, set it to hover. And with hover, this will only apply the style when your mouse is over top of it. And in this case, I'm going to set it to black, and we'll set the text decoration back to underline. So now when I mouse over it, we'll get a little black text and an underline so that we can see that it is something clickable that we want to interact with. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. Click the little save button. With this, we also need to fix this for different widths. So in Firefox, it's got this handy little button up here, which is the flexible, responsive styling. We can kind of contract this a little bit and see where we run into issues. Right here, around 544 pixels, 44 pixels, the name breaks to another line. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to run out of space and get these squished together either. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the style only after certain widths. So at about 550 pixels, I'll go ahead and copy this number. We're going to set a different style to take over. So 550, I'm going to create an @media screen, and so this is just the syntax you have to type in. And in parentheses, we're going to put a max width, colon, and then paste in 550. We do need to specify its pixels, so 550 pixels. And then in more curly brackets, we can now bring our selectors back in and kind of change the way this works. First thing I want to do is I want to change the way the nav bar it kind of breaks down, or kind of has its flex set. The default is to flex by row. We want to flex to column, so I'm going to set flex direction column. So that'll kind of stack these. We also want to make sure everything gets centered, so we're going to do text align center. We're also going to get rid of those margins that we set on the UL and the span. So we're going to do nav span margin. I'm going to set it to just 0, and the list here. We'll set that to margin 0. Always remember semicolons. And let's see how that's working. So it collapses. Now we're almost there, except we've got some padding issues too. I forgot to take off the padding on our unordered list, so make sure that we've got padding is set to 0. There. Now it is kind of pushing it off to the edges. So instead of getting rid of the margin here on the unordered list, what we're going to do is we're going to set it to 0 top and bottom, and 1 EM left and right. And that'll just let it kind of squish in a little bit, but still give it just a little bit of space around the edges there. So now when it collapses, we don't have any issues with it kind of getting too close together. As long as we're fine at about 320 pixels, we should be good to go. So 320 right there, we are good to go. So I'm just going to go ahead and close that. Now we can move on to the header. So the header will start to get a little bit faster. The navigation is usually the longest one. With the header, again, we'll just select it. In curly brackets, I'm going to set a background image. So background image. Now this one is a little bit different because we need to set a URL to tell it where to point to another file. So URL, and then in parentheses we can put the file, where we're supposed to find the file. I'm going to pop over here to Atom and expand out my images folder. The one that we're going to be using is this toast file, or at least the one that I'm going to be using is this toast file. But how do we get our CSS to navigate to it? Atom has a handy feature where we can right-click on this and we can copy the project path and then paste it in here. Let's change our slash to a forward slash. Make sure we get our semicolon. But we're not seeing an image pop up here. And I'm going to go ahead and save my style sheet. Go over to Inspector, expand out the header, select it, and we see that it is getting applied, but when we mouse over the image, it says it can't load the image. This is part of relative links. When you're linking, it's relative to the file that you're linking from. And essentially what this is saying is look in the images folder for the toast.jpg. Well, if I look in our file folder and I look right here, well, we have an images folder, but we're not linking from one of these HTML files, we're linking from the CSS file. So it's relative to the CSS file. And if I open up the CSS folder, click on it, and look around, well, there's no images folder here. So we need to tell it to go back up out of the folder that it's in to find this URL. So let's go back to our style editor. To tell it to go back up a directory, we just put in .. And now we got our image to show up. So .. that'll tell it to go up a directory and then look for the images toast.jpg. Now I'm going to go ahead and put our size for this image. So we can do background size and set it to cover. You can play around with different settings here. I'm going to also do background position. So position, I'm going to just set it to center. You can do top, bottom, I think even bottom left and bottom right, but I'm just going to put it at center. I'll keep the center of that image right centered with the box at all times. Now we're also going to add a little bit of padding to this. We're going to add some padding top and bottom. So above is going to be, or top and bottom is going to be 2 EM, and then left and right is going to be 0. We're also going to set this to display all the elements inside of it as flex. So we're going to set display flex. We're going to change our flex direction to column so that all of our stuff kind of gets stacked on top. We're also going to, let's go ahead and change our font color as well while we're doing this. Set that to white so we can actually see our text a little bit better over this image. Use flex direction column. And then we're also going to set our justify content to space evenly. And we're going to go ahead and also set our text to align in the middle. So we're going to do text, align, center. And what that'll do is center the text in its box. The text is a little bit hard to read, and as we change the width of this, it's actually going to move around on the image. In order to make sure that it's kind of visible at all times, I'm going to add a little bit of a border around it. But instead of adding a border around the text or something kind of kludgy, I'm going to add a text shadow. With a text shadow, you need to specify 4 numbers and also the color. So the first 2 numbers are the direction that it offsets, X and Y, and then the third number is how much it blurs, and the fourth property, or fourth value, is the color. So for offset, just to see what it does, I'm going to set it 10 pixels, 10 pixels, make sure there's no space between those. For the blur, we'll set it as, I don't know, 5 pixels, and then we'll set the color to black. You can see now we've got this little drop shadow behind it. I don't really want to have a drop shadow, I just want it to kind of darken the area around that text so it's a little bit easier to read. So I'm just going to set the offset to nothing. And for the blur, I'll set this up to like 10 pixels, or like 8 pixels maybe. 10 is fine. All right. Now, I'm also going to kind of play around with the size of this, but we're going to do that with Flexbox later. So for now, I'm just going to leave it as is. It's looking pretty good. So now we'll move on to content. For content, it's a little bit different. Since content was a div tag with a class instead of just selecting a HTML tag like that, we're going to need to do dot content. And hopefully it finds that for us. If you want to select a class, you use a dot at the beginning. If you want to select an ID, you would use a hashtag or a pound sign at the beginning. But other than that, it's pretty much the same as selecting anything else. For content, this is going to be pretty simple. We're just going to give it some margin on the left and right. So we're going to do margin, top and bottom, actually, so margin. Top and bottom, we'll set it to 1 EM, and left and right we'll set to 2 EM, so everything's kind of in line with our Navbar at the top. All right. And if we wanted, we could also do flex here, but it's not really necessary with this because we're going to do a sticky footer later. Finally, on the footer, we'll go ahead and do a background color. Black. Set our text color to white. So it shows up on the black background. We'll give it some padding. Let's do 2 EM above and below, and actually let's do 2 EM all the way around, so everything stays in line where it should be. We're also going to use Flexbox, so we'll do display flex. We'll do justify content space between. And this div tag that I put all these links in, let's go ahead and actually make these links a brighter color too so we can actually see them. So I'm going to add another line break here and we'll come back up, but I'll do footer, div, anchor. We can actually just do all the anchor tags in the footer if we do it like this. Footer A, that'll select all of the anchor tags inside the footer. We'll just do color, wheat. So instead of white, we'll do wheat just to differentiate it so it's something that's clearly clickable. So footer A, color wheat, and then we'll also get rid of the text direction. And we'll also go ahead and set our hover for this. And I guess actually we'll just use the same color that we used for the navigation background up at the top, this color right here. So I'll copy it, making sure to get the hashtag. Color. So on my mouse hover, let's go ahead and set our text decoration to underline again. So now when we mouse over it, we get that nice underline. Okay, so now we can actually see this stuff. Makes it a little bit easier to position it. So we'll go back up here to the div tag that contains all those links. So the span we'll set to flex 1. The div tag, so footer div, we'll set to flex 1 also. But we're also going to set it to display flex, and then that way we can kind of control how the links inside of it move around. So we'll set that to justify content, space between. So it'll kind of use up all of that space. And if we wanted to make the first one a little bit bigger, we could actually set this span to 2. That'll make it a little bit bigger and just kind of push these guys off to the right a little bit further. Now we're also going to run into the same issue here that we had with the navigation, where let's go into our responsive design here. Once we get down to a certain width, they're going to start to kind of collapse on themselves. We're going to lose a lot of the space between them, so we're going to want to change that behavior. And I noticed too that these lose space and kind of collapse pretty quickly, so I'm also going to, on these anchors, add a little bit of padding, or a little bit of margin rather. So on margin, we'll just do 0 top and bottom and 1, actually let's do 0.5 EM left and right, and that'll just keep them from getting too squished as we get closer together. But right here, see that line is breaking to another line, so probably about 500 we can go ahead and break that, or set our media query to break that to 2 lines. So we've got the copyright notice on top and the navigation below. So we'll set at media screen, and in parentheses we'll set our max width to 500 pixels, and in curly brackets we will set the footer flex direction to column. This is a little bit big right now, so we'll just scale it down. There we go. So that's at 496. Let's put it right at 500. Okay, so at 500 now we can see what it's doing here. So now we've got some other design choices we need to change. So we're also going to set our text to center, so everything's kind of on top of itself. And then we're also going to set this div tag to be a little bit smaller. So instead of, well, actually I think that's probably fine. Let's go all the way down to 320. Yeah, so that'll be fine. Okay, so now it is responsive and it changes dynamically. Now, the last thing that we need to do, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my responsive design mode, is we need to get this footer to stick to the bottom. It's kind of weird that we have this like empty space down here at the bottom. And so we need to get the footer to kind of just always be at the bottom and get these other elements to kind of fill up that space. So we can do that with Flexbox. But before we can do that, we need to set the box, or the elements that contain all this stuff, to have a specific size. We want those to contain to be 100%. So I'm going to go all the way back up here to my top level commands. I'm going to set an HTML command, so HTML and body. In curly brackets, I want to set those to 100% height. So height 100%. Percentage is based on the parent element. For HTML and body, that's just going to be whatever the screen happens to be that it contains it. So now if I go to Inspector and I scroll up here to the body, so now it's going to take up the entire screen. which is exactly what we want. We're going to go back over to our style editor. Let's go ahead and save this while we're at it. And now we can go down to the body and we can set it to display flex. We can use, since the body is taking up all that space, we can use that space more efficiently. So now we can set display flex. We're going to do flex direction because this obviously doesn't look right. We're going to do justify content to space between. What that'll do is just kind of spread these out. Now we've gotten, because this header isn't quite big enough, we've got a little bit of white space at the top, but that's fine. We can go ahead and set the header and the content areas to kind of fill up that space. So now I'm going to go down to, we've got our header here. So header, we'll do flex. I'll set it to 1, and it will fill up that space. Let's go ahead and set the content flex. And we'll set that to 1, and it'll basically just kind of evenly distribute the space between our header and our content areas. If we had more content, we might want to kind of shrink down the header. If we had more header content, this kind of depends on what your design is, how you want to use that. And now we kind of make our window a little bit narrower. Everything should work all the way down to really narrow phone size. You could get more picky and kind of go in and maybe on like phone widths, like fix these margins up. But for now, and just for the sake of time, we'll leave it at that. Now, as for all of this stuff, you don't just kind of know all this stuff. The more of it you do, obviously, the more of it you learn. But there are tons of commands. We really only just scratched the surface of that. But as you're working on a website, as you're kind of learning these things, you want to be looking at W3 Schools. W3 Schools has not only definitions and usage guides, but interactive tutorials for basically everything you could ever possibly want to know about CSS or HTML. In that sense, it's kind of the easiest thing in the world to learn, because whatever you want to know, you can just come to this website and they have an interactive tutorial that shows you how to do it. They also have JavaScript as well, which is super handy. So it's not just that, they've also got Python, they've got jQuery, SQL, basically everything you could possibly want. And this has been a very, very basic introduction to those websites, and just to kind of show you what you can create in a very short period of time. But as you're working on a website, you want to constantly be looking at this and kind of typing things in and looking at how to use it and using this to kind of solve issues as you go along. All right, I hope that's been helpful, and I will see you in the next video.